Good evening. My name is Danielle McCormick, and today I will be presenting my capstone research to you. The topic of my research was project-based learning, otherwise known as PBL. And one of the problems that's happening in PBL schools is that although it's increasing in popularity, while more schools are implementing PBL, not a lot of teachers are being trained in it. And so this is actually the third school that I've worked at that implements PBL. I teach for the District of Columbia Public School System, and they are also planning on rolling out a PBL initiative in the coming years. And there's a real gap in alignment with PBL, both design of units and implementation between teachers. And so there's a real need to ground teacher practice in the design principles of PBL. So my research question was, how can an organizational tool support consistent PBL design and implementation in schools? The product that I designed was a manual that integrates professional development and resources on PBL to guide teachers through the design of a PBL unit. And so the vision for the use of this tool is to be implemented during team planning meetings in 4 sessions. The first of which will be creating a scope and sequence with a 3-bend model. And I'll talk a little bit about what the 3 bends are later in this presentation. Another session would be focused on designing an inquiry-based unit launch. The third session would be focused on developing student-chosen case studies. And then finally, after implementing some of the actual unit, teachers would come back together to integrate student critique and revision into final product creation. So this was a mixed methods research study. I used both qualitative and quantitative data in the research. The qualitative data were open-ended questions that asked educators what has been most supportive in their PBL implementation and what was still needed. The participants were 7 language arts teachers at my school who have all been implementing PBL. And so I wanted to get an idea of what has their experience been like, what kind of support have they already received, and what do they still need in order to align their practice. And for the quantitative items, I used a combination of true and false items, Likert scales, and ranking scales to get an idea of what PBL practice currently looks like in the school and to identify priorities for improvement. So for data collection, I used a mixed method survey and sent it out to my colleagues. And then in order to analyze the results, I used content analysis to evaluate qualitative responses. This helps me to identify common themes. And then I used frequency distribution to analyze the quantitative data, which really helped contextualize and help us understand a little bit more of what those different themes looks like in school and teacher practice. And so for the qualitative data results, you can see here a word cloud with some of the more prominent phrases or words used. And 3 themes arose from the qualitative data. That was collaborative planning time, project-based learning, professional development and resources, and then making learning student-centered. As you can see here, it was really important that time was a huge theme. And one of the things that I noticed as I looked at the specific responses for time was that teachers really wanted it to be regarding planning, and they wanted more time to collaborate with different stakeholders, whether that was colleagues or also students and their families. There was also a huge ask for more professional development and resources. It was one of the things that teachers found most supported thus far in their PBL implementation, was being able to work with colleagues, get ideas and resources from them. And there were identified gaps in teachers' professional development up until this point in project-based learning. So teachers were saying, we've never been trained, we don't know how to implement this, we really want to be more deeply grounded in these design principles in order to implement them with alignment and efficacy. And then finally, there were a lot of trends about making learning more student-centered. So uplifting student voice and choice, integrating their cultures and their families, getting feedback from students about PBL implementation. Those were a lot of the different themes that arose in order to identify that the students are the heart and the center of this work. And that was really indicative in the qualitative data responses. And then the quantitative data corroborated a lot of this. I asked teachers to rank which design principles needed the most development as a school. Student voice and choice had the most first priority rankings. Sustained inquiry had the most second priority rankings, and critique and revision had the most third priority rankings. And this was actually supported by a couple of other Likert scales, where only 71.4% of teachers said that learning was inquiry-based, only sometimes. And really, when we're doing project-based learning, we really want inquiry to be the driving force. And so we really want to see an increase in the frequency of inquiry-based learning. And then regarding critique and reflection, teachers, 57.1% of teachers said that students are only giving and receiving feedback sometimes as well. That's also something that we want to increase and we want to have happening continually and frequently throughout a PBL unit. So another ranking scale was I asked teachers which part of the design process or the planning process needed the most support and improvement as a school. And so backmapping learning objectives had the most number one votes. There was a four-way tie between other parts of the planning process, but differentiation and developing the scope and sequence had second priority votes, whereas you can see establishing task and topic and identifying text did not. So with that, I identified differentiation, constructing scope and sequence, and backmapping learning objectives as like the three highest priority parts of the design and planning process that teachers needed the most support with in order to align their PBL practice and design. And so putting all of this together, I came to the conclusion that in order to align PBL design and implementation, a tool really needed to guide teachers through the creation of 3 bend units. And so a bend is basically a subunit. We're breaking the units up into these 3 parts. And each of these parts was actually directly aligned with one of the design principles that teachers had identified as needing more development. And so the bends consist of first an inquiry-based launch. This is going to ground the learning in inquiry and guide it throughout the rest of the unit. Then 2 would be student-chosen case studies where the students get to choose the topics and they form kind of expert groups that are more student-led, which would improve student voice and choice. And then the third bend would be focused on the critique and revision of final products in order to work towards actually presenting their products to the community. And so while guiding teachers through this structure of unit design, the tool and the manual actually integrates professional development and resources from some of the leading project-based learning organizations in the country. Some strengths of this research was that it was mixed methods, and being a mixed method study provides more robust and holistic data. The quantitative data is very concrete, whereas the qualitative data provides a little bit more context and a little bit more storytelling into what does this quantitative data mean. And they actually both really complemented each other. So I'm happy that we saw some alignment and some marriage between the quantitative and qualitative data. Some weaknesses was that I meant for the ranking scale items to be forced ranking scales, but unfortunately the way that Google Forms populated it, teachers were able to select more than one, like first priority, second priority, third priority. And so I actually had 2 participants who selected multiple first priorities, which would have skewed some of the data, but I just instead saw that as them identifying multiple priorities, and we took that. But my preference would have been to have like a true forced rank scale. Another weakness is that it's just a small participant pool. I would be really curious to see what the feedback and insight from teachers would look like across multiple schools, multiple age ranges, and just school settings, especially because people have different experiences with professional development, support, coaching, etc. Some factors that may have influenced the data include teachers' experiences, right? So, for instance, how were teachers' recent team meetings going? I could sense some emotionality in some teachers' responses, and I think that might have been informed by potentially frustrating recent meetings that they had doing this work. I also conducted this survey during observation season, and so emotions can run high, and people can feel positively or negatively depending on what kind of observation feedback they may have received recently. I think that in project-based learning schools, we're asking teachers to take on a lot, and so if they get a negative or less favorable observation, they can feel frustrated, like, what support am I getting to be successful, right? And so in that case, resentment can sometimes build. I think it also depends on how long the teacher has been at the school. So the school started implementing project-based learning about 4 years ago, and it has evolved every year. And so for teachers who, this was their first year, there were a couple of those, they have way less context, whereas other teachers have seen what it was like before they started implementing project-based learning and how what kinds of resources or support they've received, or also what kind of challenges they've seen. And so there's just different experience levels. And then finally, I think that participants' experience with their grade level team probably influences their perspective and their feedback about project-based learning, because it is an inherently deeply collaborative endeavor. And so you could see that some teams felt more empowered, collaborative. They saw more of the impact, the positive impact that PBL can have on students, whereas some teams felt more disconnected. They felt like a lot of the work was very teacher-centered and teacher-driven, and needed to collaborate and with more stakeholders, including students and their families. There's already very limited research on project-based learning, and what little there is tends to be really focused on higher education and STEM. And so I think we are in need of further investigation around project-based learning in elementary schools. 2 out of the 3 schools that I have done PBL in are bilingual, and I would be really curious to hear more about what that looks like and what kinds of supports are going to really help teachers with that practice. And a lot of the research is also grounded in the impact of PBL on students, but not what supports teachers need and what is most effective or impactful in improving teacher PBL practice. So there's definitely a need for more research about what is going to have the most effective, impactful support for teachers implementing PBL. And specifically, I think, what kinds of professional development, because when I was doing the literature review, professional development can look like so many different things. And so I think it's important for us to get a better idea of like what professional development is going to be most effective, is going to be most supportive, because PBL is a huge undertaking. It really takes a lot of like ongoing support. And so which forms of professional development are going to really support teachers to implement these design principles so that the efficacy, the impact, and the effectiveness is there. Thank you for